Hello, thank you for being here. This video is created for you to relax or fall asleep to, so if you enjoy such videos, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Now tuck yourself under the warm blankets and get ready to drift off into a peaceful sleep. I never expected a simple train ride to turn into something so terrifying. It was supposed to be just another journey, a quiet trip back home after visiting family. But I'll never forget the night I took the midnight train. It started as any other evening. I arrived at the station just in time for the 11:45 p.m. train. The platform was nearly empty, only a few tired passengers waiting to board. The air was cool and the faint of the station lights was the only sound. As I checked my ticket, I noticed how quiet the place was. I didn't think much of it. Late trains are usually empty after all. The train pulled in, its wheels screeching against the tracks. I boarded, found my seat by the window, and settled in. The train wasn't full, so I had the row all to myself. I watched as the station lights faded into the distance, and the train began its journey into the darkness of the night. It was about an hour into the ride when I first noticed something strange. The train felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the usual sounds of the train, like the soft clinking of the metal and of the engine, had stopped. The train was silent, as if it were drifting through the night without making a sound. I glanced around, but there were only a few passengers scattered in the other carriages, all sitting quietly. I tried to brush it off, maybe the train was just in a quiet stretch of track. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. Through the window, I could see a dark figure standing near the tracks. It was tall and hunched, its features hidden by the darkness. The figure was standing still, staring at the train as it passed. I blinked, thinking it was just my imagination, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. It hadn't moved. I turned away quickly, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I needed to stay calm. There was nothing to worry about. But then the lights flickered. The whole train seemed to shudder, and for a moment the lights went completely out. The sudden darkness made my heart race. I fumbled for my phone, trying to use the flashlight, but just as quickly the lights flickered back on. The train was still moving, but something felt wrong. The air felt heavier now, as if it were pressing in from all sides. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just an electrical glitch. But as I looked around, I realised I was the only one left in my car. The other passengers were gone. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps from somewhere further down the train, but when I looked down the aisle, there was no one there. I stood up feeling uneasy. I wanted to get off at the next stop, but the train didn't seem to be slowing down. In fact, it seemed like it was going faster. Windows showed nothing but blackness. No streetlights, no signs of any nearby towns, just an endless void. I made my way to the next car, hoping to find someone, anyone. But when I opened the door, I froze. The car was empty except for a single figure standing at the far end, a tall man in a long coat facing away from me. His back was to me, but I could see his shoulders shaking slightly like he was. Crying? I called out, my voice trembling. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The man didn't move. There was no response. I took a step forward, but just as I was about to call out again, I heard a low growl from somewhere in the darkness of the train. It wasn't like any animal sound I had ever heard. Low, guttural, almost human. My heart pounded. I stepped back, the growl getting louder. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. The train wasn't just empty, it was wrong. The air was thick now, and it felt harder to breathe. I turned and ran back to my car, but as I reached the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing in the doorway blocking my way. It was the same man, but his face was different now. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. His skin was pale, almost grey, and his coat was torn, hanging loosely from his shoulders. He was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see in nightmares. Wide, unnaturally wide. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. The man didn't answer. He took a slow step forward, his grin never faltering. I turned and bolted down the aisle, not looking back. The train was shaking now, jerking as if something was trying to pull it off the tracks. I heard the growling again, louder this time, like something was chasing me. I reached the last car and threw the door open, but there was no way out. There was nothing beyond the train, just empty, endless darkness. I couldn't see the station lights, no other train cars, just a void. I looked around desperate, and then I saw it, the conductor, or rather what had been the conductor. He was standing at the end of the car, staring at me with hollow eyes, his face twisted in a horrific smile. His uniform was stained, ripped, and he was holding a small ticket in his hand. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he said, his voice cold and raspy. "This is the train that never stops." Before I could respond, the train lurched again and the lights flickered out completely. When I woke up, I was sitting at the station, just as I had been before I boarded. The train was gone and the platform was empty, like nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't just a dream. I could feel it, the cold chill in the air, the weight of something watching me. I never took another train after that night, and every time I hear the sound of a train in the distance, my heart skips a beat. I know there are trains out there that don't just go from one place to another, they take you somewhere you can't escape. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a quick ride from one city to another, a simple way to get home. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on the train. It all started when I missed the last bus back to my apartment. The city was dark and the streets were empty, save for a few late-night walkers and the off-distant cars. I was about to call a cab when I noticed the train station up ahead. The lights from the platform flickered in the distance, and I saw a train sitting there, waiting. I checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. The last train for the night should have left by now. But the train was still there, its doors open, as if inviting me in. I decided to take it. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I was feeling a little adventurous. Either way, I climbed aboard. The inside of the train was surprisingly quiet, with only a few passengers sitting in their seats, reading or staring out the windows. There was something almost comforting about the stillness. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down, grateful that I'd be home soon. The train began moving and I settled back, watching the city lights blur into the darkness. I noticed that the further we went, the fewer stops the train seemed to make. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a non-stop route late at night. But as the train passed through the outskirts of the city, something began to feel off. The train was moving faster than it should have been, and the lights inside flickered erratically. The gentle of the engine had a strange, unnatural sound, like something was struggling beneath the surface. I glanced around. The other passengers hadn't seemed to notice. They were still in their seats, staring out the windows or lost in their own worlds. I felt a chill run through me, but I brushed it off. It was just my imagination, right? Then the train began to slow, but instead of pulling into a station, it stopped in the middle of nowhere. The lights flickered once more, and the entire train jolted as if it had hit something. The air inside the car turned cold, and I could see my breath in front of me. I stood up, unsure of what to do. The train had stopped, but there was no station, no sign of where we were, just darkness outside the windows. The only sound was the faint rattling of the train's metal frame. "Is anyone else getting off?" I asked, walking down the aisle and trying to make eye contact with the other passengers. But no one responded. They just sat there, unmoving. It was like they didn't even hear me. I felt my heart race. This wasn't normal. I should have gotten off when I had the chance, but it was too late now. Suddenly the train doors slammed shut on their own, locking me in. I tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to shout for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. I wasn't sure if it was just my fear, or if something really was wrong with the train. But every instinct told me to get off. I tried another door, but it was the same. The train wouldn't let me out. I turned and ran down the aisle toward the conductor's cabin, hoping to find someone who could explain what was going on. When I reached the front, I found the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, but to my horror, The cabin was empty. No conductor, no staff, just a single ticket lying on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, but the moment my fingers brushed the paper, I felt a cold breeze rush past me. A gust of wind so cold it made my skin crawl. I looked up and that's when I saw it. The figure was standing at the far end of the cabin, a tall, shadowy figure, dressed in a black coat and hat. It stood still facing me, its face obscured in darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched. I froze, unable to speak or move. The air felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. The figure took a slow step toward me, and as it did, the lights on the train flickered again, revealing its face. It wasn't a face at all. It was like a void, a deep black hole where eyes and a mouth should have been. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. I felt like it was pulling me into the darkness, like I was being suffocated by the sheer emptiness of its presence. I turned and bolted back down the aisle, my heart pounding. I reached the exit door again, desperately pulling at the handle, but the door wouldn't open. The figure was getting closer now, its steps slow and deliberate. The train was moving again, faster this time, and I could hear a strange mechanical groan coming from somewhere deep within the engine. The sound of the train's wheels screeching against the tracks was deafening. And then I heard something else. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You're not getting off this train." I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure had vanished. I could feel my legs shaking, my body trembling with fear. But then a voice came over the loudspeaker. "This is your final destination," it said in a cold, monotone voice. "This is the last ride." I froze. The voice didn't sound human. It was as if the train itself was speaking to me, as if the train knew. I reached for the emergency brake, but it was too late. The train was no longer slowing down. It was speeding up, racing into the darkness. There was no sign of any station or destination, just the endless void of night outside the windows. And that's when I saw the truth. The passengers weren't just asleep or lost in thought. They were gone. Their faces were blank, like they were all staring into nothingness, trapped in their own world. I was the only one left alive. The train didn't stop, it never stopped, and I realised I wasn't on a normal train at all. This was something else, something far worse. I don't know how long I've been riding this cursed train, or if it will ever end. Every time I try to speak or scream, the voice on the speakers warns me that this is my final destination. But I know the truth now. The train has no end, and neither do I. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when I boarded the train. I had just finished a long day at work, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with a crowded, uncomfortable ride home. But the weather was terrible, and I didn't want to risk waiting for a taxi or getting soaked by the rain. The train was my only option. The platform was crowded with other commuters, everyone looking just as tired and ready to go home as I was. When the train finally arrived, it was nearly full, but there was one empty seat near the back. I took it without thinking twice. The train pulled out of the station, and I settled in, trying to ignore the cold and wet clothes clinging to my skin. The soft of the engine and the rattle of the wheels against the tracks made me sleepy. I closed my eyes for a moment, just trying to relax. At the next stop, a man got on. He was tall, with dark hair and a coat that looked too heavy for the season. He walked down the aisle slowly as if he were scanning the passengers, looking for something or someone. When his eyes met mine, I felt a sudden chill run through me. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was seeing something I didn't want him to see. But I quickly dismissed it as nothing. It was probably just my tired mind playing tricks. He stood by the door for a few moments, but there were no seats available. I noticed that he was looking at the empty space beside me, and then he walked toward me. My stomach tightened as he came closer. I didn't want to be rude, but I really didn't want to sit next to this man. I had a bad feeling about him. Before I could move or do anything, he sat down beside me, his coat brushed against my arm, and I felt a strange coldness seep through my skin. I tried not to let it bother me, but I couldn't shake the sense of discomfort. I focused on the window, trying to ignore the man. The city lights blurred past as the train sped through the dark night, but something about the atmosphere felt off. The other passengers were unusually quiet, their heads bowed, their eyes closed. There was no chatter, no soft murmurs of conversation. It was as though everyone had fallen into a deep, unsettling silence. I glanced around nervously, but the man beside me was staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. His presence felt like a shadow hanging over me, like he didn't belong here. It was hard to describe, but it was as if his very being didn't fit into this world. His movements were too smooth, his gaze too still, as if he weren't fully alive. I shivered and turned away from him, focusing on the passing scenery once again. The rain had started coming down harder, the sound of it pounding against the train's windows almost drowning out the engine. But then, in the middle of the noise, I heard something. A faint whisper, just behind my ear, "Get off." I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. My first instinct was to look at the man beside me, but when I turned my head, he was no longer there. The seat next to me was empty. I blinked, confused. Had I imagined it? Had the whisper come from somewhere else? The train was crowded, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The doors of the train slid open at the next stop, and people began to shuffle out. I thought about getting off myself, but something kept me rooted to my seat. The feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't go away. My hands were clammy, and my thoughts raced. But before I could stand up, the doors closed again and the train started moving. The man appeared once more, but this time he was standing at the front of the car. He didn't walk, he just stood still, staring at me. His eyes locked with mine, and this time I could feel the weight of his gaze as if it were pressing down on me. There was nothing human in his eyes. They were empty, like two black pits. And that's when I noticed something else. The passengers around me were no longer moving. They were frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide open but lifeless. It was like they were all statues trapped in place. Panic surged through me. I stood up looking around, but the car was still empty, except for the motionless passengers and the man at the front. I took a step toward the door, but the man's voice came again, clear as day. "You can't leave." I turned back, heart pounding in my chest, but the train didn't stop. It kept moving faster, the lights flickering above us like they were struggling to stay on. I reached for the emergency brake, but there was nothing. The train was now racing through the darkness, the stations blurring by at impossible speeds. "Get off." The whisper came again, this time from somewhere closer, right behind me. I spun around, but the man wasn't there. In fact, no one was. The train had emptied. The other passengers had disappeared, and I was completely alone, except for the strange man who was still standing in the front of the car watching me. I ran toward him, my breath shallow, my mind clouded with terror. But as I reached him, the man turned towards me, his face still hidden in shadow. Slowly he raised his hand. "No one ever gets off," he said in a voice that wasn't quite human. Then the train slowed to a stop, but we were nowhere near a station. The doors opened, and a cold gust of wind blew in, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decay. I stepped forward cautiously, my feet feeling heavy like they were sinking into the floor. The man didn't move, just watched me. The door was open, but I couldn't see where it led. There was only blackness outside, nothing beyond the threshold. I hesitated, but the whisper came again, sharp and insistent. "Get off." I turned back to look at the train, at the empty seats, at the lifeless passengers. It felt like I had no choice. I stepped off the train, and the moment my foot touched the ground, I realised that everything had changed. The world outside was wrong. The air was thick, the sky was dark, and the ground beneath me felt like it was made of something other than solid earth. The train had disappeared, and in its place was a desolate landscape stretching out in all directions. I was no longer on a train, I was somewhere else, somewhere I was never supposed to be. The last thing I heard before the door closed behind me was the man's voice. Distant and fading, "No one ever leaves."